as we approach the problem of suffering and evil, we have to ask ourselves, what do we believe ultimate reality to be? And how is the problem to be seen against the background of ultimate reality? And in the ancient world, you had people that believed that mass energy was ultimate reality. You have many people in the academy today that believe that. They are materialist naturalists. There are others in the ancient world, like my heroes Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, who believed that there was transcendence, there were the gods, there was God, there was a creator who created the universe and who upholds it in being. And then there were the skeptics, the ancient postmoderns, and so on. And a third family of worldviews is the family of pantheism, where God and the universe coalesce into something fundamentally impersonal. And in a sense, those are the 3 or 4 major options. There are many sub-options within them, but they can help us navigate our way, at least into the beginnings of this very difficult problem. So suffering coming from 2 logically distinct sources. And the intellectual response, first of all, has been well expressed by David Hume. I quote, "Epicurus's old questions are yet unanswered. Is he, that is God, willing to prevent evil, but not able? Then is he impotent? Is he able but not willing? Then is he malevolent? Is he both able and willing? Whence then this evil?" Now, I find among my friends, and I mean my friends, not just my acquaintances, I have many people who look at the mixed signals that the universe sends to us and experience does, and they become atheists. They don't become agnostics so much as atheists. And I'll never forget meeting 2 people from Israel in Austria at one stage, and we were talking about these things, and they said, "We are atheists." And I said, I'd be very interested to know why, because part of the reason I believe in God is your history as a nation. And they said, "Well, we don't want to tell you." And I said, "Well, that's okay." I said, "Why don't you want to tell me?" Well, they said, "You seem to be a very nice young man." It was a long time ago, ladies and gentlemen. "You seem to be a very nice young man, and we wouldn't like to disturb your faith." And I said, "That's very kind, but you know, I believe in evidence-based faith as much as you guys believe in evidence-based medicine. And if my faith cannot meet objections, it's not worth believing in anyway." So in the end, they made up their minds to tell me. And they said, as husband and wife, they read books to each other. And they'd been reading a book by the Israeli Nobel laureate for literature, Bashevis Singer, called The Slave. And in the book, he describes how at one stage in Russia, Jewish women and children were buried alive. And I don't know whether it was Singer or not. I've read the book, but my memory fades slightly here. But what they said to me was, in that instant, the light went out. And we haven't believed in God since. I sympathize with that, ladies and gentlemen. I've stood in Auschwitz many times and I've wept every time. Many times. And you will know people who have been injured. My own brother was nearly killed by a terrorist bomb in Northern Ireland. I come from a country where there's been violence in the name of religion, in the name of Christianity, actually. We may want to get to that at some stage. So I can understand and deeply sympathize with a person that says to me, as a scientist, "Okay, you talk to me about evidence for God and the rational intelligibility of the universe and the fine-tuning of the universe in its mathematical describability, etc., etc., etc. Okay, the God of the philosophers may exist in some distant realm, but please don't talk to me about a personal God who cares for us. Don't insult me. Because my experience of life has been so negative and so horrible that I cannot possibly bring myself to believe in such a God." Now, I would like to bring up the fact that, looking at it just a moment from the intellectual side, if I may, Many of my atheist friends feel that they've solved the problem of suffering and evil. Now, what do they mean by a solution? Well, what they mean is the universe is bleak, you just have to accept it as it is. The extreme version of that is given by Richard Dawkins, whom I've debated, as some of you may know. And Richard Dawkins' view is that in a universe of blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt. Other people are going to get lucky, and you won't find any rhyme or reason in it, nor any justice. The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect. If there is at the bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good. Nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. DNA neither knows nor cares. DNA just is. And we dance to its music. Now, it's important to take atheism seriously. I do, very seriously. And I want you to notice about this analysis, which is a reductionist taking Dawkins' naturalism to its logical conclusion. Did you notice exactly what he said? That there is no good and no evil. DNA just is, and we dance to its music. Now, of course, that means that the people that flew the planes into the Twin Towers on 9/11 were dancing to the music of their DNA, as was Pol Pot and Stalin and Hitler. And of course, you know, if people are simply dancing to their DNA, how can you blame them? Well, Dawkins can't, because there's no good, no evil. Now, what I find very odd about that, ladies and gentlemen, is that it is obvious logically that this is a consequence of their worldview. But secondly, what's not obvious to me is how they can then start making moral criticisms of God or moral criticisms of anything else. Because they're saying there is no morality, there is no good, there is no evil. Well, if there is no good, there is no evil, that's it. And the problem of evil vanishes intellectually. And you say, I'm not satisfied with that. Well, good, I'm not either. And the reason I'm not is this, that when we logically analyze it from a philosophical perspective, taking this hard atheist view that there's no good, there's no evil, the trouble is we are moral beings and we see good and evil. Now, from where I sit as a Christian, that makes perfect sense, because I believe that every person in this room, whether they believe in God or not, is made in the image of God and is therefore a moral being capable of seeing good and evil. And that's why, even when Dawkins' logical philosophical arguments leads him to deny the existence of both, he still makes a moral diatribe against God because he's a moral being. It at least explains that curious inconsistency. Now, the second thing is this. Atheism is not a solution in that it doesn't remove the suffering. The suffering's still there. If you feel that atheism is the right intellectual solution to the problem of evil, please notice what your solution doesn't do. It doesn't alleviate the suffering. And indeed, I will want to argue a little later on that it can make it 10,000 times worse. Because, of course, atheism, by definition, death is the end. And so there's no hope of any putting things right. There's no hope of any compensation. There's no hope of any moral compensation if you have been a victim of moral evil. So there is, to my mind, a very major problem. And it's very interesting, you know. I deliberately went 2 years ago to Ground Zero. I happened to be staying very near it, but I thought I'd listen to the reading of the names. You all know what the reading of the names is. Very moving. But you know, as I listened for hour after hour to the reading of the names, something struck me. There wasn't an atheist mention. There were many mentions of faith in God against the background of 9/11. And indeed, most moving of all was listening to parents or young people saying happy birthday, Dad, when they lost their dad, and talking as if their dad was still alive. I found that almost heartbreaking. But it was so interesting. In the face of consummate evil, moral evil, nobody was talking about the non-existence of God. The people actually in the suffering appeared to be drawn nearer to God. They weren't denying the existence of God. Of course, that doesn't prove anything. It's simply an observable fact that struck me very, very clearly. If we go down the atheist route, of course, we find this curious contradiction that I've mentioned, because any mentioning of the problem of evil, we all react similarly to these atrocities. And the interest in that is we behave as if our judgment was objectively true. That is, we expect everybody else to condemn 9/11. Why? Because we believe it is absolutely wrong. We believe in absolute moral values in some areas. I know nobody who doesn't, except people who are very seriously mentally disturbed. And J.L. Mackie was a famous Oxford philosopher who was an atheist. But he said, if there are objective moral values in the universe, and there appear to be, there's a direct line from there to the existence of God. Because it's very difficult, and even Dawkins confessed that up until relatively recently when Sam Harris changed his mind, that you cannot get objective morality without belief in God. Charles Taylor is one of the interesting commentators in our age of public intellectuals, and he says, you know, the modern age, more or less repudiating the idea of a divine lawgiver, has nevertheless tried to retain the ideas of moral right and wrong, not noticing that, in casting God aside, they've also abolished the conditions of meaningfulness for moral right and wrong as well. Thus, even educated persons sometimes declare that such things as war or abortion or the violation of certain human rights are morally wrong, and they imagine that they've said something true and significant. Educated people do not need to be told, however, that questions such as these, now this is Charles Taylor, questions such as these have never been answered outside of religion. And I spent a lot of time in Russia, and behind the Iron Curtain. I'm old as the hills, you see, so I used to go behind the Iron Curtain in those days because I was very interested in what atheism does to a society. And one of the things that I was told again and again is Nietzsche was right. When Nietzsche said, if you get rid of God, you'll ultimately get rid of value for human beings. And many a Russian intellectual has said to me, you know, we thought we could get rid of God and retain a value for human beings, and we discovered we couldn't. So there's that connection. If we're asking about a source of moral evil, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, when he gave his address, when he turned up in North America some years ago, said, if I were to sum up what it is that's caused the moral evil of the 20th century, and 100 million of my fellow citizens in Russia died, I would say we have forgotten God. So there are people joining dots in that particular way, which you may wish to question as we go through. So I'm just going to mention a word because it came before, because very often when it comes to moral evil, people will say, but just a moment, isn't belief in God part of the problem? Look at you, coming from Northern Ireland. What on earth right have you to talk, of all people, that belief in God actually is a protector against moral evil, when in your country there have been atrocities of Protestants fighting Catholics and so on and so forth. I know all about that. Well, let me tell you something personal, but it'll illustrate it. My parents were Christian, but they weren't sectarian. That was very unusual in my country. How did it manifest itself? It manifested itself in my parents employing equally across Protestant and Catholic. They believed, and they taught me, that every person is made in the image of God and therefore of equal value, no matter what they believe. Secondly, they allowed me to think, which is why I'm standing here now and why I haven't rebelled against what I learned from my parents. But you see, if I'm asked in the face of the moral evil and the people left widowed by having their husbands murdered by terrorists, either Protestant or IRA, on that side. What do I say about it? Well, I say I'm utterly ashamed of it, utterly ashamed of it, utterly ashamed that the name of Christ has ever been associated with an AK-47. But the important thing for tonight is not that I'm ashamed of it, it's why I'm ashamed of it. And why I'm ashamed of it is that Jesus stood in our world and said, my kingdom is not of this world, otherwise my servants would be fighting. So that people who take up guns or bombs to defend Christianity are not followers of Christ, they're denying him and disobeying him, so they're not Christian. And that's part of the problem that I as a Christian have to face, that accusation. But I believe the history shows that Christ himself, and here's the irony of the whole thing, as I pointed out to the late Christopher Hitchens, who was accusing religion in general and Christianity of all kinds of abuse, I said, Christopher, listen, if you actually had read what Jesus taught and the way he behaved to the underdog, to people who were exploited and suffering and so on, you'd be on his side. You wouldn't be fighting him. You'd be on his side. So you obviously haven't read this stuff, because Jesus was tried on the charge that Christianity, his message, was fomenting political violence. It was causing suffering. It was causing evil. He was exonerated from it because Pilate was sufficient of an intelligent person and a military general to see that someone who said, to this end was I born and to this end I came into the world, that I should bear witness to the truth, was no threat to him. Because the one thing, ladies and gentlemen, you cannot do by violence is impose truth. You just can't do it. So it seems to me that point number one is, if you espouse atheism as a reaction to the problem of suffering, you're not over. The story isn't over yet, because you're left with the suffering. And you're left without any hope, because all you have is death, and that's it.